Hello, Cornerstone. Next week we are going to be studying Romans 7, 1 through 12. And I think it's helpful to give a little review of where we've gotten to in Romans. And I frequently will go through with my connection group and talk about the big picture of Romans to keep reminding those of those big themes. And really what we've done so far is the first 3 chapters of Romans. Paul is describing our hopeless condition. And then at the end of 3:21, he introduces this amazing concept that we are justified by faith alone. And it's not about us. It's not about following rules. And it's totally outside ourselves. It's not based on what we have done, but what Christ has done through us. And really, he goes into that concept into chapters 3, 4, and 5. And the last couple of weeks, we've been in chapter 6. And in chapter 6, he asked the question both in verse 1 and in verse 3. In verse 15, he said, "Shall we keep on sinning so that grace may increase?" And obviously the answer to that is no, absolutely not. And really in the last half of chapter 6, Paul never talks about the law. And the question is brought up, does freedom from the law, does that make lawless people? Do justified people, should they sin more or should they sin less? And Paul goes into that. And really, what we're going to do in chapter 7 is introduce this idea of the law and how does the law answer that fundamental question in chapter 6 is, shall we keep on sinning so that grace may increase? And what part does the law play into this? And so I'm just going to kind of work through some of the questions and answers that I'm going to talk about in my group. And Paul starts out this chapter with a comparison of the purpose of law for a married couple and the purpose of law for a Christian. And he goes through this detailed explanation that says, hey, if you're married and if you marry someone else, they call it adultery. But if you're married and your spouse dies, well, then you're free to marry someone else. It's okay for you to marry someone else. And then he says, in the same way, you're not under law anymore. You're dead to law. And I think the first question that we should really bring out of here is, what is the result of not being under the law? What happens that we're not under the law anymore? And really, in verse 4, Paul gives us the answer to that. He says, therefore, my brothers, you were put to death in relation to law. So first of all, we're not under the law anymore. That's part of the new covenant. We're put to death in relation to law so that you may belong to another. And so the reason that the law was put to death, in the same way that if our spouse was put to death, if our spouse died, we're free to marry another. We're put to death according to law so that we can join another. And obviously that another is Christ. And in verse 4, then he describes that relationship. He says, so that we may bear fruit for God. And then also in verse 6, where he says, at the end of verse 6, where he says, so that we may serve in a new way of the Spirit and not in the old letter of the law. And so it's important for us to understand that the result of us not being under the law is that so we can be joined, Paul uses that marriage relationship so that we can be joined to another so that, number one, we can bear fruit, and number two, we can serve in a new way of the Spirit. And so I do think it's important for us to, out of this chapter, for us to really understand the bigger picture of the law. And really what I'm going to talk about in my group is why is it important for a Christian to have a worldview that acknowledges the law of God? And really, I think in our day and age, people can accept the idea of a loving God because there is no consequences with that. But if people accept the idea of having a just God, a God who has laws, and that were set up from the beginning of time, we have natural laws in the universe, well, then it exposes the whole idea of right and wrong. The idea that law exposes sin. Without law, there is no sin. And the world loves a place where there is no sin, where there is no rules, where everything is relative based on what I want to do. And so obviously, we as Christians, we believe that there is a law, and this law is good. And so the next way that I'm going to go is talk about this idea of what would happen if you did not have any law in civil life. And so let's say I'm one that struggles perhaps a little bit with driving laws and speed laws. And I know exactly what would happen if there was no laws in the speeding roadway civil life. And so I would go as absolutely fast as I wanted to. I would enjoy it, and what would happen is there would be death and chaos in the world. And so, you know, it's a little bit of a hard concept for us to grasp, because we think about if we get rid of laws in the civil world, that there would be freedom. If there is no speeding laws, I would be able to speed. And if there was no laws for this, if there was no law to pay taxes, then I wouldn't pay taxes and I would have more money. Well, in reality, the law in the Christian life functions in some ways in the same way, but in some ways a different way. And so remember back to the first question and that idea that the purpose of the law is so that we can join in a relationship with Christ. And having this idea of a relationship with Christ will totally transform how we perceive following God's, how we look at our Christian life. And so this idea of this relationship totally transforms really how we look at it. If I so loved my country, for instance, perhaps I wouldn't speed. And so you can talk a little bit about the civil and the Christian side of it. Another interesting question I think that comes out of this is the idea of, is the law good or bad? Is the law good or bad? And really throughout here, you know, Paul has a tremendous amount of things to say about the law. But I do think that it's valuable for you to go to verse 12, where he says, "So then, the law is holy, and the commandment, the law, is holy, just, and good." And so realize, to reconcile this with other Paul's writings, Paul is not saying that the law is bad. He's saying the law is good, just that we're not under it anymore, and we have a new relationship to it. Finally, to kind of close up here, this idea of Paul talks about the sin using the law and sin using the law to deceive us. And I really think there's two ditches that we can go on. And it's important to understand how sin always lies, and sin can use the law to lie to us. And the two lies I think that we see is, number one, it says, oh, I could never keep this law. There's no way I keep the law, and we are condemned by it. The second way is we see the law and we say, oh, you know, I can keep the law. And it provides this self-righteousness where we try to earn our way to salvation. Both ways can be condemning to us. So, very interesting passage. I know you'll have a great discussion in your groups.